Good evening, and welcome to St. Paul's. I'm glad I said evening because I'm so used to saying good morning, good morning. Our program this evening is sponsored by the John Walsh Library Committee. The library was endowed by Father Walsh, our founding pastor, who was a very avid reader, and I certainly can attest to that. One of his favorite quotes was, I put my glasses on for this, "Every reader is not a leader, but every leader must be a reader." And this quote is attributed to Harry S. Truman. And Father Walsh had this printed on his, when he was celebrating his 50th anniversary. Now, today, last January, the Library Committee arranged for the parish read by giving every family the Wisdom of Fulton Sheen. Tonight, Father Joe Hart will discuss the wit, the wisdom, and the contributions of Bishop Sheen. But first, I'd like to give you just a little history about our parish for some of the people that are new. Our parish was formally established on May 12th, 1967, by Bishop Fulton Sheen. He phoned Father Walsh at St. Mary's in Auburn on April 19th, and he asked him to be pastor of the new church on Hart Road in Webster, New York. The bishop announced the appointment on April 23rd. On May 1st, Father Walsh asked Bishop Sheen that the parish be named St. Paul's, after the great saint and apostle and the Pope at that time, Pope Paul VI. Many of you know Father Hart, as he was with us as a Sunday associate from 1979 to 1995. But he wasn't just a Sunday associate. He was very, very involved in the parish with everyone. Father Hart is a John Fisher graduate with a BA in literature. He has an MA from the U of R. He has 2 masters from St. Bernard's and a doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Italy. Father Hart was a naval chaplain. He was also a chaplain here in Rochester for children's services for Monroe County. He taught at St. Bernard's. He was also director of finance and business affairs there. Bishop Clark made him the Vicar General and the moderator of the Curia for the Diocese of Rochester. He is now a pastor at Our Lady, Queen of Peace, and St. Thomas More, and he serves and has served on many, many boards. It is with the greatest of pleasure that I welcome Father Joe Hart back to St. Paul's.
Thank God I came early or it'd be late. Thanks very much for coming to explore a little bit of Fulton Sheen, who didn't spend very long in our diocese. And some of that we'll talk about. He came to our diocese after the Second Vatican Council and was in a hurry. Part of that is because Christus Dominus at the Second Vatican Council had said bishops had to retire at 75. He was 71. Now, why would Rome send someone here, so late in life? Well, the first backstory. Now, a lot of us here remember that Fulton Sheen was a TV star. He went into the Dumont television network and offered his services. They had a spot across from Milton Berle, the most popular show on television. They had nobody else to put on, so they agreed to he drove Milton Berle off the air. Berle, in the meantime, made all kinds of jokes about Uncle Fulty. Because he was made the director of the propagation of the faith before that, and had this long familiarity with the media. He had been on radio, the Catholic Hour, for about 25 years before this venture into TV. Cardinal Spellman had made him an auxiliary bishop of New York, and maybe with some ulterior motives. Because before long, a dispute broke out. Who would deliver the money that was being raised for the propagation of the faith to Rome? Because the one who was as Father Walsh always called him, whoever was the bagman, bought influence. The Spellman wanted all the influence he could get. Bishop Sheen said, no, that wasn't right, that he had an obligation as both the one who raised the money, but also the director of the propagation of the faith, to make sure that it went to the propagation of the faith. The Spellman strongly disagreed and took Sheen to court in Rome. Spellman lost. Spellman first forbade him to speak in any church of the Archdiocese of New York, which isn't really too bad because, remember, one of the only places in the world where a diocese is split half through a city, Brooklyn and New York were two different cities before the Brooklyn Bridge united them. So, the Bishop of Brooklyn welcomed him with open arms to speak in any church. But Spellman wanted him out of his sight. So, he wanted him named a bishop elsewhere. Paul VI gave Bishop Sheen 4 choices. And although later Bishop Sheen would say that he chose Rochester for its priests, he probably chose Rochester for its airport. Because he was still filming, although the Life is Worth Living seasons were over in the 50s, he was still on various shows on television and still filming when he came to Rochester. When Bishop Sheen turned over in retirement close to his death, all of his books, all of his papers to St. Bernard's and now in the Diocesan Archives, he handed Father Brennan, the rector of the seminary, a manila envelope, which he said, everything else can be explored by historians, anyone who's interested in his papers, etc. But until I die, the envelope has to stay with you. At that point, the phone rang, and the librarian and the rector got to get up, and Fulton told them to stay. And they figured out later that it was Archbishop O'Mara, his successor at the propagation of the faith, who said to him that he was to keep that envelope in his desk. So he took it back and said, when I die, it'll be here in the desk. When he died, there was no envelope in the desk. A few years ago, telling the story to Cardinal Dolan, who has a degree in history, a doctorate in history, he said, I know where that envelope is. Cardinal O'Mara delivered it to the nunciature in Washington for safekeeping. What's in that envelope, we don't know, except what we think is that the whole issue with Cardinal Spellman was all wrapped up in that. And because the friends wanted to protect him, that was probably never to be seen again. Not destroyed, but in a safe in Washington. Now let's get back to Rochester. He finally arrives, and as I said, he's in a hurry. But he's also in a hurry because, yes, he probably expected to live out his life at the propagation of the faith in New York. But he had all these ideas after the council about how best to implement this teaching or that teaching. And being a man of ideas, he was constantly thinking. The problem was, he didn't know how to implement stuff. So there always wasn't a practical part of it. So, for example, we were talking about the building of St. Paul's in Webster, his first parish, all done within the first year he's here. He picks a number out of the hat and said that the church was to be built for $200,000. Now, this wasn't after consultation about how much a church would cost. No, it's just $200,000. Well, Father Walsh, then at the end, again, with a cinder block building, and you remember it was just one half of this facing this way at that point. The architect telling him that he would never again deal with such a fixed amount. So when Father Walsh went in to have the mortgage signed by the bishop, he said, well, what's this? Well, we built the building for $200,000, but this is the furnishings. Now, again, the furnishings, for those who remember, were folding chairs. The reredos made out of pieces of metal and wood through some friends at Kodak. So, well, I won't sign it, he said. And he got up and left the room. And he came back and said, well, I guess you've got me on semantics. And so he signed it. But that's a beginning illustration of an idea, and part of the idea at the council, he and a number of bishops met of trying to highlight the plight of the poor throughout the world, and so hence churches had to be more simple, and it was a great idea, and they had to be multi-purpose spaces. And those of you who remember that the original reredos simply had a tabernacle in the middle with two doors which closed over, said that the whole space could be turned over to a multicultural space, but something didn't seem right, and so it was almost never used in the way the bishop thought of it. Now, that first year, everything then changed. So we won't have a chancery office. We're going to have a pastoral center. More to what we're really about. We're not going to have me all over the place. We're going to have vicars. We're going to have a vicar for urban ministry, for pastoral planning, for religious education, in the southern tier, in the eastern tier. Lay people are to be brought in as advisors. That would include John Ermatinger from this parish as a financial advisor. He established a priest council and also a priest personnel board. He expanded the curriculum at St. Bernard's. He wrote to 200 professors throughout the world, inviting them to teach at his seminary. He took St. Andrew's Seminary and morphed it into the King's Preparatory School, a co-ed high school for the spiritually elite. This is all within 6 months. This is every day, so much so that the priests in talking would say, we're not in a diocese, we're in Disneyland. And we don't know whether we're in Frontierland or Tomorrowland until the clock strikes midnight. Taking right away to the challenges of the day, he was invited immediately. Again, he was installed in December of '66. Right away, in January of '67, the Chamber of Commerce wanted him to speak. Television personality, great speaker. So he began. Once there was a beautiful lady with a wart at the end of her nose. The lady was Eastman Kodak, and the lady is Rochester, and the wart is Eastman Kodak. You can hear the gasps. This is not somebody who had been here 10 years, who kind of had discussions, etc. But Kodak wouldn't hire African Americans. It hadn't from the time of George Eastman. Now, he went on, of course, in that talk to say, a little ointment could cure this defect. And he talked about incremental job opportunities and the support for urban renewal and improved housing. That's all within 1 month of his arrival. Now, the Second Vatican Council also, in one of its decrees called Nostra Aetate, about Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and other such faiths. So he wanted to implement that. So he's invited to Brit Kodesh. Now, Brit Kodesh is the oldest of the synagogues in Rochester from the 1840s. No Catholic prelate had ever darkened their door. But he was determined in the short time he was in Rochester, which, again, when he arrived, would have been a maximum of 41 months, to make this diocese the model of conciliar renewal, kind of like St. Charles Borromeo in the 16th century with the Council of Trent. So, in rapid succession then, he undertook and publicized, well, that's an important thing here, and publicized. Well, if you're going to be the model, other people have to know about your model throughout the country in order for other bishops to learn from the local wisdom here. The problem was that he would send press releases to the New York Times, but not to the Democrat and Chronicle, the Times Union, Time Magazine, yeah. So, needless to say that the local newspapers were not very happy with the new bishop. Again, so Bishop Sheen is an idea man with a lively imagination, and his proposals were often insightful, thoughtful, brilliant, far-sighted. But again, the talent was in coming up with ideas, not with implementing. So unless someone was appointed or volunteered to translate an idea into some concrete terms, it would often come to nothing. Father Joe Brennan, the rector of the seminary, said that every day that Bishop Sheen was in town, he called him, and every time the phone rang, he shuddered. Now, part of that wasn't just because he had ideas for the seminary. I said he had sent out 200 invitations. One day he goes to the front door. It's in the evening. No one was answering it. He answers it, and here's a man with a suitcase. So, can I help you? Yes, I'm Dr. David Rocks. Well, welcome, David. I'm here to teach on your faculty. Oh, isn't it good? And what is your special? Now, David was, at one point, the chief rabbi of Warsaw and had become a Roman Catholic, and of course was disowned by all of his family, all of his colleagues, everybody. He had ended up at Mount Savior Monastery in Elmira, where Bishop Sheen found him. Father Brennan would say that when this happened, and it wasn't the only time it happened, his chief job was to, first of all, find out what he was supposed to be teaching and how that would fit into the curriculum. But more importantly, how much did he say he was hiring you for? So no notice, etc. Now, but more than that, Father Brennan said he spent hours on Bishop Sheen, wanted to work up a proposal on something. And a week later, he would present it to the bishop in written form, and the bishop would say, "Oh, what's this? Oh, remember you asked me to, oh, yes, and would toss it on his desk, and that was the last you ever heard of it. He had moved on. He wasn't thinking about that anymore. One day a secretary told me that they were driving through Tioga County, and the bishop said, Father Hogan, who lives beyond those hills? By the way, that wasn't just the television personality. He actually acted like that, you know, so who's and, but by the way, so this would have been Bishop Hogan's younger brother, who could have been a stand-up comedian in in Las Vegas and made an absolute fortune. The bishop absolutely loved him because every tense situation, every difficult thing was all smoothed over by, he could get the bishop into uproarious laughter in no time at all. So this day he asks, and of course Tioga County remains one of the poorer places in the diocese. And so the next day he called in a priest to announce that he had decided that there would be what was called the secular mission. Now, there would be behind this, of course, evangelization, but at the beginning, it's really trying to relieve people from poverty. And so you would be an instrument of change. So he called in and put this priest in charge of the secular mission to relieve poverty in the rural areas of the diocese. When the priest left the bishop's office, he stood outside and talking as if to no one, said, "So where am I to live? Where am I to work? Who pays me? What's my job description? Who do I report to?" Just the usual stuff. No, just congratulations, you're in charge of the secular mission. Christus Dominus, the Constitution from the Second Vatican Council on the role of bishops, says that the bishop is to be not just the father, but the brother to the priests. And so, to implement that, the bishop decided that he would invite small groups to dine with him. Needless to say, people, not only just with their bishop, but with the television personality, these were deadly kinds of things. No one dared say a word. So it was kind of he really tried, but it was, that's how Father Hogan and other places could ease the conversation, because Bishop Sheen wasn't made of small talk conversation. But he liked priests and wanted to take care of them, so he raised their salaries. That was popular. He set a retirement age for priests at 70. Rome had not yet come with a retirement age for priests, but the bishop thought it should be 70. And then he implemented a priest pension fund, because Christus Dominus had said that the bishops had to take care of what they called the social security of priests. But the diocese didn't have money. But he discovered that from the time of the troubles of the stock market crash and the whole depression which had followed, the priests of the diocese had gotten together and put together a self-help fund, everybody kind of putting money in twice a year, and out of that fund helping somebody who got into financial trouble, sometimes even helping their parents who got into financial trouble. So it's called the Clergy Relief Society. It's still going. But the bishop, seeing that they had a couple $1 million, which didn't really belong to the diocese, it belonged to the priest, didn't bother him. So he took the $2 million and established then this pension fund. It was going to pay out $230 a month. But that also meant there was another corollary to this. That meant that priests wouldn't any longer be able to fund their retirement as had been traditional. Now, the traditional one was the Christmas collection at all the masses in its entirety belonged to the pastor. And out of that, he was to save and invest and take care of his retirement. Father Walsh talks about he was in Elmira, the pastor died. They called the chancery to say, what do we do with the Christmas collection? Divided among the priests is what the answer was. They joyfully did so. And Father Walsh then took his mother back to Ireland for the first time. So, but back to this. Now, you can imagine if you were in a very large and wealthy parish, that the Christmas collection was considerable. But if you were in most parishes in the diocese, it was pretty meager. But that meant that if you were saying no more Christmas collections, that's to take every powerful pastor in the diocese and to cut their throat, they thought. He made enemies immediately. Again, this is all within, Christmas is over. This is going on almost immediately afterwards. He's in a hurry. Well, in theory, Bishop Sheen welcomed every bit of the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, with its emphasis on dialogue, consultation, but in practice it was different. While he would discuss various plans with his official staff, it was usually after he had already made up his mind, maybe even had announced it. He was bored with presbyteral council meetings. Taxidermists talking to taxidermists, he said. And well, with some imagination, he assembled various lay committees. If during their first meeting, the views of their members differed from his, that's the last time that meeting would be called. And while he tried to convince the other bishops to make some moves on things that really did have to be done, like merging the seminaries in upstate New York. There was just too many. There was one at Niagara Falls, one at Buffalo, one at St. Bonaventure, Rochester, Albany. This was crazy because they're expensive operations. So he was right, but parochialism didn't bring that about, in fact, for another 50 years. So if he was going to have St. Bernard's, then it was going to have to be the best seminary in the world. So he reclaimed its right to grant degrees. They had stopped in the 1930s because it was too secular. Of course, Bishop McQuaid, the founder of the diocese, who was the founder of Seton Hall University and served as its first and third president, the second guy kind of ruined the place. And he was an academic man who, of course, the seminary would grant degrees. So suddenly under Bishop Sheen, the seminary is once again granting Masters of Divinity, Masters of Theology. But more than that, he entered into discussion with Colgate Rochester Divinity School because he had in mind that ecumenism can't be just a theory. You have to put it into some practical space. So how much better that you've got this seminary, which nominally was Baptist, but in fact it, in theory, or in practice had taken all kinds of Presbyterians and Baptists and and all kinds of others. So he went into conversation with the president of Colgate-Rochester in order to found an ecumenical seminary. Now, again, he said everybody would have to retain their own identity, their faculty, their curriculum, their doctrinal integrity, while sharing one locale and support services, by which point they could save a great amount of money. So the bishop didn't want to build a building on that campus, he wanted it nearby. So, for example, the state owns some land not too far away, and he was quite interested in that. But what happened, if you remember those times, because it happened at Cornell, etc., suddenly the African American students, together in what they called a Black Caucus, staged a lockout of the Colgate-Rochester administration until the administration agreed to hire a certain quota of African American professors, administration members, and board members. Well, that was the end of that. Bishop Sheen announced he was putting the project on hold for a year, and probably he already knew that he wouldn't be there the next year. The bishop was practically concerned with the poor. So one lady had taken him aside, and he went with her to her house where she had a husband and 3 children. And he paid for a house for them. That was the beginning then of we've got to do something corporately about the city doesn't have proper housing. And so therefore, he asked 70 people to donate $10 a week for 24 weeks in order to found what became to be named the Bishop Sheen Housing Corporation. Initially, it was to rehab houses. It's still in existence. And Bishop Hogan would later do this in conjunction with the Episcopal Diocese of Rochester. But that was only just the beginning. What he thought was, we've got these parishes in the city that don't have very many Catholics anymore. So he decided without consultation, except for informing the Vatican and getting permission and informing the apostolic delegate in Washington, but not telling anybody in Rochester, not even the Rochester Housing Authority, which had the supervisory role of over all public housing, nor the pastor of the parish he had decided to give away, nor the priest council, or anybody. He was looking forward to a big, splashy announcement that he was giving away a parish so that he had an agreement with HUD that low-cost housing would be built upon this. Of course, there's immediate pushback from parishioners. The pastor, who of course was fanning the flames, but there was a new priest association of Rochester that was a little alarmed at all these changes taking place, but the bishop's not talking to us about them. And so on comes the Democrat and Chronicle, who were ticked at him from the beginning because he didn't talk to them at all. So they made this a front page news. So suddenly he's got pastors and the Priests Association of Rochester and the Democrat and Chronicle all saying the bishop has to revoke his gift to the federal government. So Sheen had failed for the first time in his whole life. It's something he had planned and had invested personally in, was in shambles. The people who worked with him in the pastoral center said from March 3rd, 1968, he was a changed man. The spark had gone out of him. This was no longer fun. He did his work, but in early 1969, he resigns. In typical fashion, he goes to Rome and resigns directly to Paul VI. And part of that is because he had asked for an auxiliary bishop, and he had already, very early on, decided it would be Joseph Hogan. And inexpediently, obviously because his driver is Joseph Hogan's brother, they would stop in Lima to talk to Mrs. Hogan. And she was having spells. I think that's what they called them. They were probably little mini strokes. So Bishop Sheen inexpediently says, Mary, you've got to hold on. Your son's about to be named an auxiliary bishop. Well, soon enough, the announcement was made. You have to turn in a list of 3 names. And the Congregation of Bishops chose number 2 and number 3, but not number 1. So now the bishop is embarrassed, even before Mrs. Hogan. Mrs. Hogan, according to Bishop Hogan, said to me, his mother called and said, Lloyd, by the way, his baptismal name was Lloyd Joseph. But the first day in the seminary, he got called in and said, that's an unseemly name for a priest. From this moment on, you're Joseph Lloyd. So anyway, so his mother says, Lloyd, I didn't care if they made you a bishop or not. But why did they have to name the 2 ugliest priests in the diocese? Only a mother could say that. So anyway, Bishop Sheen, now not wanting to deal with the Congregation of Bishops, he goes to Paul VI, and one envelope is his resignation. The other envelope is, this is the name of my successor. The Pope says, I'll do the best I can, but no promises. So that's why 1 year you've got 2 new auxiliaries, and the following year you've got a 3rd person out of nowhere comes, in fact, to lead the diocese. There was all kinds of lasting effects of the bishop. Now, of course, in the celebration after the installation of Bishop and ordination installation of Bishop Hogan, there was a big banquet at one of the high schools. And Bishop Sheen, who had not been in Rochester since he had resigned, said, now to my brother priests, the things I left unsaid and should have said, for the times I monologued when I should have dialogued, forgive me. Of course, Bishop Carney then got up and started reciting some verses from Tennyson, and everybody thought he's lost it. Until he changes the last lines. Bishops come and bishops go, but I live on and on. So anyway, what are the lasting effects? Well, he revised that chancery to include laity of competence, making it a pastoral center, quite larger than the small chancery that existed before him. Again, as I said, establishing priest council and personnel board, still going. Priest pension, it's luckily paying more than $335 or $235 a month. Secondly, a conscious need of the world's poor, local poor. He established the Spanish apostolate, still going. He opened St. Bernard's to lay people and women, nuns. He set in motion something which would come later when St. Bernard's Institute moved to the Colgate campus. He began the permanent diaconate here. In fact, was the first in the country. He raised the age of confirmation from 6th grade. He put it at the end of high school. He did move local companies eventually to hire African Americans. And he put in place an internship year. After you had finished 4 years of seminary, you had to spend 1 year in the parish before you would be ordained. Oh, by the way, he came up with that idea and announced that he was an invited bishop to the first Synod of Bishops in Rome. That was his proposal there. He sent that notice to the New York Times. And also clinical pastoral education. This is still going too. At this point, only the Archdiocese of Chicago and Rochester required this program where you had to spend at least 1/4 of the year, or 1/2, 2/4, as in hospital ministry, so that you got a real sense of life and death, of pain and suffering. The canonization of Bishop Sheen is on hold, so of course we can ask the question, was Bishop Sheen a saint? You can say that he was honestly a good and dedicated priest who really loved people. But he really struggled with the temptation of, I guess we'd call it pride, all his life. He had all these degrees from the Catholic University in theology and in law, at the University of Louvain in philosophy. And more than that, after you had completed that, if you had the others and you did further study for a year and underwent horrible examination, you could be awarded what is called the agrégé, the aggregation of, and this made you ready, in Europe at least, for that you could teach not just in a college level, but in the highest of university levels. Fulton Sheen got one of those. And according to his story at least, if you passed, they called you back into the auditorium. The last thing was made quite public, the examination quite public, that they didn't serve wine for him. That's what they served champagne. So he had done remarkably well. But then he turned around and made up one of his doctorates. He didn't get a doctorate in theology from Rome. He always wanted one, so you put it down. As a TV star, he had worldwide recognition. For example, at the Second Vatican Council, when the debate is on ad gentes, so this is on the evangelization of people, he gets up. There's usually about 2,300 bishops who are lining the main aisle of St. Peter's on raised platform. And as he approached the microphone, they're quiet. And as Yves Congar, one of the great theologians of the last century, Dominican, says that everybody waited because here's somebody who knew how to control the microphone, who could keep the crowd. When he finished, the bishop stood and applauded. So this is the hero among heroes. This is the, by the way, Congar, this is his council diary, which was private, that got published. And he says, of course, they applauded. He says, I did not applaud. So Congar didn't agree with his theology. That's another whole day. He acted like a star sometimes. So one of our priests tells the story about how he was coming from a place and walking next to the bishop, and the bishop said, could you walk one step behind? They're taking photographs. You could also, I've seen it a number of times, people would raise the camera and he would turn because he always believed that this side of the face was much more photogenic, and so he would pose with that. In a way, he thought that probably Rochester was beneath him. It's interesting, and I meant to bring it tonight, and I apologize for that. His coat of arms. Now, a bishop's coat of arms is normally, the image for a bishop is that it's a marriage with a local church. And so therefore, in the coat of arms, the two arms are impaled. So they're joined together. So that on the left-hand side would be the arms of the Diocese of Rochester. On the right would be the arms of the new bishop. So joined together. That's why he wears a ring, because it's the wedding ring. In fact, Innocent III in the 13th century, up until that point, if you're a bishop, even if it's of a little tiny diocese like Steubenville, Ohio, that's it for life. So you might be Augustine, and you're only in this little regional center one weekend, and the bishop who says that he's dying, and you have to, this is all, of course, staged, he didn't know this, you have to elect your new bishop today. Oh, he's here, they said. He's Augustine. No, Augustine said, I'm only here for the weekend. No, they dragged him up, they ordained him right there. Of course, I've often suggested to various bishops that it's a perfect way that you can have, you have no vocation shortage if you simply can drag them up and ordain them. And it just, so, but you're bound to a diocese then. Oh, Innocent III said, no, if, given the Pauline privilege from 1 Corinthians 7, I can dissolve a marriage. If I can dissolve a marriage, well, then I can dissolve a marriage of a bishop and his diocese, and I can move him to a more important place. Bishop Sheen's coat of arms was the Sheehan coat of arms. It's the dove with the olive branch, kind of from the story of Noah and the ark, but it's a sign of peace. And then there's just a world below it, just a globe. That didn't get impaled. Instead, just between the dove and the world is a little X. Now, the X is a saltine cross, which is the St. Andrew's cross from the Diocese of Rochester's coat of arms. Which is to say that the marriage never really took. That he didn't get joined with us. And that's a kind of a lasting symbol. So when you're in the cathedral and you look up and see the coats of arms on the balcony or the former choir loft, you'll see with wonder, oh yeah, there it is. It's not impaled with Rochester. Because the reason he ignored the local press was he was a man of the world, not Rochester. And so his pride could get hurt. Once when celebrating Mass at St. Bernard's, as he would always do afterwards, they would send a prie-dieu in the middle, and he would kneel down and pray afterwards. He was a wonderful man of prayer. But after that period of thanksgiving, when he finished, he rose to meet the rector at the door. And suddenly a student who had been very quiet over here praying stood up and went over to the central aisle to greet the bishop. And he thanked the bishop for his beautiful and thoughtful sermon. But he reminded the bishop that the Second Vatican Council wanted preachers to preach homilies, not sermons. So the bishop said, yes, you're right. And yet, as they say in the Constitution on the Liturgy, it's preferred, but there's times when this would be important. So the student went down to the refectory, and the bishop joined Father Brennan. And he said, now, Father Brennan, who was that? And what diocese is he from? New Jersey, luckily. And the bishop said, get rid of him. So examine him further, discover get rid of him. How dare him question me? Bishop Sheen, even when he was a professor at Catholic University, he built his own house there. He lived with another professor who, after several years, moved out because Bishop Sheen was gone all the time. Or actually, Monsignor Sheen at that point was gone all the time because besides teaching his courses, he was all over the country and sometimes all over the world giving talks. He had this absolute ability to take complicated subjects and to make them absolutely understandable to a general audience. It was a marvelous gift. And even when he first started the Life is Worth Living series, he wanted to be so precise. There's no cue cards. He's not reading off a script. This is all memorized. And he had the ending memorized, so therefore, if you're watching the clock, you know when you have to begin to do this. But in order to keep it absolutely tight, that whole first year, he first wrote it out in English and then translated it into French and then back into English, because that would give it absolute tightness. That's the brilliance of the man. But money flowed in, And he never kept much records, and it flowed out. He was extremely generous, awfully generous, to the Africans who visited him in this diocese. But Father Tormey, for example, who's still alive, remembers very early on, they were taking a flight to New York, and Bishop Sheen said, "Oh, Father Tormey, come, sit with me." And then the bishop, "So where are you sitting, Bishop?" "Oh, well, how did that happen? How did I end up in first class?" See, because that's how he always traveled. So, though he advanced up the ladder for the formal advancement towards sainthood, declared servant of God in 2000, so therefore they found enough there for the beginning process and the canonization to begin. In 2019 was named Venerable, which is the next step. There was a miracle connected with that. And they had announced, in fact, that he would be beatified, but suddenly this was canceled in 2019. In 2019, I was accompanying Bishop Clark to Rome with the other bishops of the state for the Ad Limina visit. And Bishop Matano goes into the dicastery for the causes of the saints and is there a while. And he presented evidence there that Bishop Sheen had invited a pedophile priest back into ministry. He had been, by Bishop Carney and Bishop Casey, removed from ministry. He invited him back into ministry where, again, the priest was allowed to sin once again with underage minors. Bishop Matano made the case, this is not the time in which Fulton Sheen should be named a saint. It would be a black eye on the Vatican for not having done its work. So, the bishop who called St. Paul's into being, who wanted it to be the latest thought of a place that wasn't spending money on its beautiful surroundings, but was really taking care of the poor, really taking care of the community, taking care of the life of the local church and the local community. And so you have much to be proud that the founder of your parish was and did have his heart in the right place. But maybe it also reminds us that all of us are called to holiness, and all of us are a way off. St. Paul writes to the Christians at Rome, his great letter, "The good that I would do, I don't do. And the evil I do not intend to do, I do. Woe is me." So if St. Paul, who had a vision of the risen Christ, who's been instructed on him on the very nature of the gospel, who can even say in 2 Corinthians that he's had ecstatic experiences, But he can still say, the good that I would do, I don't do. And the evil I do not intend to do, I do. Well, then maybe Bishop Sheen is like all of us, called and graced, given great talents which we've used to great good, and yet, not yet what we ought to be. So maybe our founding bishop has a lesson in that. And the only difference is that he lived his life in the brightness of publicity, and we live our lives in some quiet. But maybe this gives us some help in saying, Lord, help me to do the best I can with all that you've given me. And the dark side of me, may it day by day become less prominent, that the good that I do, I might always do. And the evil I don't intend to do no longer trips me up. Okay, well, that's all I can do. I hope that's enough. Okay. Now, I probably, because we're late, is there questions you think, or do we think better just let everybody go home? Oh, we got a reception downstairs. Oh, you better not. You better. Yes, there's booze downstairs, so you better get to that. Okay, you've got a question. Okay, well. That's good.
Because we were on the map.
Yep.
And yes, he was sent here in disgrace because someone chose and the decision was made about this, possibly, also by his brothers.
Yeah. But he also.
Who are we?
Right.
Flamboyance.
Right. But again, the reality is he couldn't listen. He could not listen. So therefore, there really were priests. Yeah, but so in other words, all we can say is, this is the record, and we probably couldn't have done any better. And so, but I think, yeah. Yep, right. 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 No, I understand that. Yeah, that's good. Anything else? Okay, we better let you get to the booze downstairs. So.
We thank you very much, Father Hart, for your very intuitive and we hope you'll come back again soon. Thank you. We invite all of you to come downstairs, join us for some light